Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for turning out. Welcome to the How To Academy and Penguin Live. It's my enormous pleasure to be able to talk this morning to someone who you may not know, Gabor Mate. As you all know, he's a doctor. He's the author of several best-selling books, including his new one, The Myth of the Normal, which has been published in 25 countries, 25 languages. Yeah. It's already published in 5 and is a bestseller in 4 of them already. What else can I say? If they gave out professorships for wisdom, then he would certainly be the professor of wisdom. Sadly, our culture is much more concerned with expertise than wisdom. But it is an extremely wise book for those of you who have not read it yet. Thank you for coming. Thank you for talking to us.
I see I'm having a bit of difficulty hearing you. I don't know if there's any mics that... Can anything be done about the sound so I get a better feedback here on the sound?
Well, I'll look directly at you when we're speaking.
Yeah. But thank you.
So the title is The Myth of the Normal, Trauma, Illness, and the Healing in a Toxic Culture. Should we start with what you mean by a toxic culture, since we all live in it?
Sure. So the analogy that we use in the introduction is in a laboratory. If you're a scientist growing microorganisms in a broth, you'd call that a culture. You say you're culturing microorganisms. And if those creatures were thriving and proliferating, you'd say that's a healthy culture. But if a lot of them are developing pathologies, dying, struggling, you say it's a toxic culture. There's something in the brew that doesn't serve the health of these microorganisms. Well, I'm saying that there's something about this culture that we live in that doesn't serve the health, that undermines the health of many of the people living in it. And you can look upon illness either as some random misfortune that hits people, very rarely dictated by genetics, but mostly just we don't know what causes it, and it's just bad luck, too bad. Or we can actually say, well, maybe there's something about the way we live that contributes to people's illness. And I'm saying that in this culture, illness is not an abnormality. It's actually a normal response to abnormal circumstances.
You also talk about, it's the main title, The Myth of the Normal.
Yeah.
And it sort of features in the book in 2 ways, doesn't it? That we think that the culture that we walk around is normal.
Yeah.
It's normal out there. It's a normal day. It's a normal week. But we think we are all normal ourselves.
Yeah.
What was it that made you start to question this idea of normal? Because you must at some point in your life have thought this is normal too.
Yeah.
What made you wake up and think, well, hang on, this isn't normal?
Yeah, so that's where the meaning of normal comes into it. See, from the medical point of view, there's a range of normal that corresponds to what is healthy and what is natural. So outside a certain spectrum of body temperature, you can't live. If your body temperature falls too low or goes too high, you can't live. Outside a certain level of blood acidity, you can't sustain life. Beyond a certain range of blood pressure, if it's too low or too high, you don't live. So in that sense, the normal range corresponds to what is healthy and what is natural. But we make the assumption in this society that what we're used to, in other words, what is norm to us, is also healthy and natural. And I'm saying it's a dangerous assumption, in fact, quite false, so that what is considered to be normal in this culture is neither healthy nor is it natural, unlike in that strict medical sense.
When we talk about the toxic culture, are we talking about the range of illnesses that are prevalent? Because it is a point you make very early on in the book that we're a very health-obsessed culture, and so it's ironic, to say the least, that there's such a tidal wave of illness and is it well accounted for in the normal medical hypothesis?
Well, first of all, why are we health obsessed? It's because people are doubt. People are anxious about their health. What's the brunt of your question? You say it again.
Well, what is it, do you think, that makes us ill in this culture?
What creates the toxicity of the culture? Well, so there's two ways you can hurt people. One is you do bad things to them, such as mistreat them. Now that happens on the individual level in the case of child abuse and so on, of which there's plenty. And on the social level, in the form of the inequalities that British research has so clearly shown to be a major source of ill health. The world-famous researchers here in England have been pioneers, in Michael Marmot and others, showing the impact of inequality. In fact, just yesterday in The Guardian, the Bishop of London was talking about health inequalities in this culture. So you saw that during COVID. Who was most likely to fall ill and to die of COVID? By significant percentages, it would be people of minorities, color, low socioeconomic status, and so on. So that inequality, and then the embedded racism and all kinds of other prejudices that beset people, what corresponds to an individual level to be individual abuse, you might say, is on a social level, the social abuse. So that's one way to hurt people, is just to do bad things to them. I mean, there was a study just 3 weeks ago, just as the book was being published, another study in the States showing that in the aftermath of racism, a racist episode, a person's immune system's activity diminishes and their hormone level changes. Just one episode like that. So there's plenty of that kind of hurting people. But the other way you can hurt people is by depriving them of their needs. So we all have a need for oxygen. You know, I don't have to hit you, but I could badly hurt you by sucking the oxygen out of this room. I'm saying that people have certain needs. Children have certain essential needs without which they don't develop in a healthy way. And adults have certain needs. And this society deprives them of those needs. So both in the active sense of imposing hurt on people, and in the more passive sense of depriving them of their needs, it's a toxic culture.
A lot of the book, you are very concerned through the whole book with children. I mean, if there's one group, and we've all been a member of that group at some point, that when you talk about hurting people or depriving people, that it's not really grown-ups you're talking about most of the time, that a lot of the hurt that people carry around with them, you say it's in the very, very earliest part of their childhood, before 1 year old. Tell us what you mean by that and why you think it happens so early.
Well, with any organism, I mean, if you're a gardener, a horticulturist, and you're planting flowers or trees, you know that the conditions that you're establishing at the earliest stages are the most important ones. So that, you know, an acorn may have the potential to develop into a mighty oak tree, but only if the conditions are right. Otherwise, it might not develop at all. So, in terms of human beings, the most important period are the formative years beginning in utero. So already, stresses on pregnant women, we know, have impact on the developing child in such a way that interferes, for example, with the stress apparatus. Like, for example, after 9/11, there was a study of women who had developed post-traumatic stress disorder while pregnant as a result of 9/11, and 1 year later, their children still had abnormal stress hormone levels. Well, you don't need 9/11 to stress women. That was just a particular example. I could name a whole lot of other studies in utero. Then there is, I spent some time in the book talking about birth practices, and human birth is not just a question of the baby being expelled from the womb. Birth was actually designed by nature for much more. It was to create a context for bonding between mother and infant. Biochemically, actually, during birth process, certainly a love cocktail, it's been called, oxytocin and endorphins and other is released. Now, modern medicine has certainly performed miracles in saving women's and children's lives when birth wasn't going well. So that's not to be either denied or decried, but they're also interfering with birth mercilessly. The way I was trained to deliver babies was really interventionist and totally unnecessary, in a way that would undermine the bonding between mother and infant. So in British Columbia, where I live, there's a cesarean section rate that's almost 40% now. That's incredible. It should be about, according to the Lancet, the British publication, this is worldwide now, especially amongst middle and upper class people in the so-called third world, China and Brazil and so on. The cesarean section rate is approaching 50%, which is unbelievable. It should be about 10 or 15%. So in utero, and by the way, if you ever given birth here, if you're ever pregnant, just raise your hand that if you went to the doctor for your prenatal visit, they asked you about your emotional states. Anybody? I don't see any hands up. Yet that's so important. You know, now they ask you about your diet maybe and your blood pressure and, you know, but nothing about your emotional states, which is amazing given how important that is. And then there's the whole childhood, how do we raise children? And what I'm saying is that we become denatured. Human beings have parenting instincts. All animals have parenting instincts. But instincts have to be evoked by the environment, so that an instinct doesn't necessarily come online. It has to be supported by the environment. In this society, people are actually trained to ignore their instincts. I mean, I give the example of my mother who writes in her diary, when I was 2 weeks of age, "Poor little Gabor, my heart is breaking for you because you've been crying to be fed for the last hour and a half, but I promised the doctor I'll only feed you every 4 hours, so I'll have to let you cry for another half an hour." Her instinct was to pick me up and to hold me. That's the maternal instinct. But she was stifling her instinct in order to comply with medical advice. By the way, medical advice that I myself used to give until I found out better, like let the baby cry it out, let them go back to sleep, all this kind of nonsense that totally inimical to human development, but which advice that we give to parents all the time. And I could go down the line in all the ways that parenting is undermined in this culture. So we get the early years wrong, and then we wonder why so many kids are being diagnosed with everything under the sun.